Hello, hello, hello. I'm sitting here with Joe, and we are ready to talk about men.
hmm
Men getting left behind. Lost men, lost boys. What does being left behind mean?
hmm
Who's leaving us behind? Do we even want to be with them in the first place? All of
hmm
that. So,
Yeah.
what are your thoughts?
Well, I guess I'll start by explaining to our audience, how this topic came about. We were talking in voice chat recently with Nathan, and we basically stumbled onto it, and we're wondering, what does it mean? Like, who are the Lost Boys? The term is borrowed from Peter Pan. I used it because I heard you say it. You use that term Lost Boys because you've heard other people say it, and Um, there's this idea that it's a relevant label to use now for what's happening with men, particularly young men, right? And then of course we're also talking about this in the aftermath of the 2024 presidential election, where it was young men who delivered Trump the swing states and brought him to the White House. Right, so Gen X was, as we had discussed before, the one age group that went majority for Trump, but if we look at where Trump really made significant gains, it was with young men, right? Young people in general had been seen as being an easy demographic for the Democrats. And in 2012, this was sort of the view on Obama's win over Romney, which is that demography is destiny, and the younger generations are going to continue to carry Democrats into the White House, but that does not continue to be the case over the last two elections. Now, in 2016, you could have said it was a one-off because Trump lost the popular vote, and then 2024, that's not the case. He not only makes a comeback, but he wins the popular vote this time. So uh, there's something going on, right? And it's not necessarily political, right? It's not. We're not. This isn't about the whole ideological aspect of it, all right? But I think we're seeing in our elections some sort of response to things that's happening in society, right? And so it's bigger than this. We don't even have to continue to discuss the political side of it, but it's sort of the shadow that's being cast, by the light on the object, right? And what is that object? How much of the shadow is there still to see? What is the true shape of it, right? What is the true thing? We can,
Hopefully, this is not going to get too abstract and
yeah,
inferential,
right.
because
So
I'm much
hopefully
better with
not.
concretes.
So, um, we could talk about the different ways that young men are being left behind. Uh,
When
and
do you think it started? Let's start with a timeline of when do you think the shift started, and maybe we can
um,
notice something at that around that time.
I think an important turning point is the 2008 Great Recession, because this is when um, sort of the younger half of millennials are coming of age, and um, many this is also like when a lot of Gen Z boys are also sort of becoming aware of what's right. They're old enough to be aware of what's going on at that point as well, like in society. So that's sort of like an important moment for them. Like I think younger half of millennials, that's also an important moment, but probably the big sort of news event that turned a lot of the younger half of millennials on was 9/11. Um, but 2008 was like a thing where the economy was fundamentally changed. It was sort of seen as like a turning point from, because it wasn't just a housing crisis, right? But one of the things that happened is it was a shift from stable career jobs to like part-time work and gig economy. And then the tech boom that followed in the 2010s really developed that gig economy. So a lot more people find work either primarily or on the side to what they normally do through doing things like Uber, which you have an app you get plugged into to do that.
Is
Um,
that a bad thing? That sounds like a great opportunity.
it can be good or bad depending on certain things. Some people do dog walking through apps. And I do my article writing through Seeking Alpha, which is very much just gig work. It's freelance. I do it at my own pace. I like that arrangement. What it lacks is um, there's a lack of, I think, the old sense of community, um, where
Did they
you
even have that before? And when we say left behind, what are we even talking about? Left behind from what? The
uh,
economy, from jobs, from girlfriends? What?
well, there's a lot of those things, and they're interrelated. So, um, gig economy also means that people don't tend to live in the same place as much. They go where the opportunity is. If they do have a traditional 9 to 5 employment, even that is kind of a gig, right? It might be a 2 to 5 year experience, and then you move on to something else. Nobody really expects that an employer who takes them on is going to have any interest in them for like a 20-year career period. That's
And,
seen
and
more.
is this strictly men or just
I think
pe-
it's people
people in
in
the
general.
modern world in general?
I think it's people in general. But one thing that was different about this period as well is that among the traditional 9 to 5 um, job experiences, there was more of an effort to employ and promote women throughout the 2010s. And so you have this period where younger people are coming of age when at a time when traditional employment is going away, and there's the more opportunistic um, gig sense. And opportunistic can be good or bad, right? Depends on the nature of the opportunity. If the opportunities are scant, right, gig economy can be pretty tough for the gig worker. And where a lot of the traditional jobs that give steady employment and maybe good benefits as well, and have work environments that aren't very troublesome, right? So, you know, cozy white collar jobs. They began adopting um, these career advancement policies, specifically oriented toward women. So like getting even number of women in a workplace where it's primarily consisting of men
That
doing
sounds
things,
sexist.
and maybe it is.
If
And
that's
then
the
also,
only criteria for hiring that, like they're diversity hires, basically.
yeah, and a lot of it was a response to like discussion around the gender pay gap. About how women are usually make what
The
about
one that's
70.
been debunked.
Yeah, it was around that. And so young women, I mean, I do think young people in general, like if you compare millennials, boomers, there was sort of a millennials and younger, I'll say. It's not just millennials. There was a mismatch between what a lot of their parents had told them would be the case, for them in their careers and the economy, where they could have expectations of, steady 9 to 5 employment, and then what was actually an opportunity in the aftermath of 2008. Right now, obviously, their parents could not have foreseen that crash, right? So these things happen. But obviously, if you've spent your whole childhood and early adulthood preparing for a different outcome that actually transpires, that um, um, can be scary and in some ways devastating, depending on where exactly you are. Right? It's a big country. I'm also, of course, talking about what's going on in America. I imagine some of this is true in Europe and other Western aligned countries. Um, but um, so young people in general have this. They really haven't improvised what their solution to being an adult is, how they're going to survive, how they're going to make it, how they're going to be financially secure. But one thing that young women are getting that young men are not is um, these employment promotion policies that are favorable toward women.
Oh,
Um,
like what?
well, what I mentioned before, the hiring policies, the promotion policies, um, there was a lot of company HR departments. There was just a lot more work to actively get their HR departments to hire more women, and then to have like women support programs in place. Like
But like you said, promotion. Like there's specific policies saying if you're a woman, we're going to promote you, but if you're a man, we're not. Because it seems like somebody could do some civil rights lawsuits and put a stop to that
some of
if
those
that's
things
what's
have been
happening.
contested, but in businesses, yeah, there was a. I mean, companies have been like publicly explicit, like putting out press releases, like they will be seeking to hire more women for certain things. And basically, when HR is making hiring decisions, they're looking at what boxes to check. Um, you know, the idea being, every time a company is hiring someone, if they can check enough boxes, that gets them hired. Um, a big check mark will come from, whether or not a candidate is female. So
Is
um,
Kennedy's what?
female.
Oh,
Um,
I didn't know this was happening. This seems
yeah,
illegal.
well, it has been contested. This is in this,
Not
this.
enough.
Yeah. So I don't think it's it's. I think one thing that's tricky is we're going to seek to recruit and hire. This is different than we will refuse to hire. Right. So it's not like we refuse to hire men.
But you do think because of this that it does seem unfair that men are being shut out of opportunities that they would otherwise have
Well,
or have had in the past.
you run that experiment for like about a decade, and I would say 2013, 2014 is when a lot of this really began. Um,
The woke.
right. It basically companies started doing this shortly around the time that started. And you have a decade of young men who go from being it, depending on where they are, 18, early 20s, from late 20s to early 30s, and how easy their life is. Um, and I don't think they feel like for all the hard work they've put into to things, whatever job they've had, that they've gotten much out of it. And I think they look around in a culture that sees them as quote unquote part of the problem all the time, even though they haven't done anything to anyone. Um, I think a lot of them, like you said about like girlfriends and stuff, are chronically single and unhappy about that, and have a hard time imagining how anyone in the past, got married and had a family like it was nothing, because it seems almost impossible for them.
So it did the guys stay the same and the women changed? Something about the women
Um,
changed?
well, so another thing that happened during this period is dating apps came out, right? So smartphones are invented. A lot of apps explode. There was this saying in the early 2010s. I remember there's an app for that. Um, and I think one of the most prime examples is dating apps. Around 2022, I think most couples reported meeting their partner on a dating app. So instead of at school or at work or at church or in public, um, it became dating apps. And dating apps are, for most men who use them, very difficult to get anywhere. It's usually 10 or 15% of men that are getting most of the dates, because it's the most attractive men. Most of the
So
men are
dating apps themselves are stacked against
yeah, and
most men.
this is based on data that dating apps have released. So dating apps, when they talk about their user data, they have pointed out that it's a handful of uh, um, um, it's a handful of men getting most of the dates. Basically, it comes down to a handful of men juggling around most of the women. We could wonder how much. I don't think the data differentiates between people who are using the apps for flings versus actual long term dating, which is say courtship on a pathway to marriage. But that is the trend. So a lot of men are getting into pretty well into adulthood with little to no romantic experience.
How much of dating has shifted to the apps? Is there still in person
So there's still some of
dating?
that,
Do they
but
still have like high school sweethearts, or do they go to
so
happy hours and talk to women in
I'll just
person?
reference the data point I mentioned before. If we're talking about couples, right? Couples, not flings, couples. Today, a majority of couples report meeting their partner on a dating app. So the dating app has
Wow.
become the mainstream for how people meet. That is a game changer, right? That's different than, you go to like think about more old school, right? If it wasn't someone like from your school, like a high school sweetheart, it would have been someone like, let's say there's like a regular hot spot in town. Maybe it's a coffee shop, maybe it's a bookstore, a
A
grocery
bar.
store, something in your town and you go there a lot, and when you go to places, I don't think this is as common anymore, but when you go to places, there are, you can regularly run into people, and they're folks that you will just run into again and again for years. And if you don't consciously make plans to see them, it's okay because you're part of a close knit community and you will regularly run into each other. That used to be more common, I think, in American life. Um, Dating apps change that a bit, but also, like I mentioned, when you shift to a gig economy and um, where your employment is constantly changing, you don't stick around in any particular town for too long. So you're going to be going to different grocery stores or bookstores throughout your life. You're not going to be going to the same one for a period of 10 or 15 years, right? Let's say you become an adult, you're 18, you go to the same library, coffee shop, grocery store, um, until you're about 30, right? You're going to run into a lot of people there, and you're going to have familiarity with people there. Eventually, this girl you've been bumping into on and off for 4 or 5 years, you might ask her out, right? And because you're not a total stranger, she's not as weirded out by it, right? Uh, but that is much less the case now. So um, there's, from the perspective of women, right? It's like there's been an explosion of strange men, and I know you've talked about before, like why there's a lot of misandry that's been coming out in the culture. Some of it I think is that women are not surrounded by men that they know very well much anymore. Um,
So
because
every man is strange now, and
yes,
strange equals creepy.
exactly. Um, right? Because like if you, um, one thing I've noticed when I listen to men and women talk about members of the opposite sex that they don't find attractive. With guys, it's usually, she has an ugly face or she's fat. It's something like that, right?
Butterface.
Yeah. Um, it's just mostly like the aesthetics of her appearance she doesn't like, and it's not so much like there's not much character based uh, evaluation put into those statements. It's just they don't like the way she looks, and I don't hear so much of it as guys disapproving her as a person. It's not what it's just a very simple.
But haven't guys always kind of been that way, more visual?
Yeah. So yeah, but when women talk about the way guys look one in ways that like they don't find attractive, they find off-putting. I find that it's sort of a visual description that has a lot more character-based things, right? So I hear they don't say guys are ugly; they say a guy looks scary. That's probably the most common one I hear is if it's a firm disapproval. He looks scary, right? They might say he looks creepy. Usually they'll talk about behavior being creepy. But even if a guy hasn't actually done anything that is creepy,
Yep.
they'll say
I
he
hate
looks.
that because a lot of it gets a lot of autistics
Mhm.
get on the internet because to women we
Yeah,
appear weird. We appear like creepy guys when it's just the autism.
yeah, and one thing I've noticed is even guys that you might think are handsome, um, are sometimes considered scary, just depending on what that woman's idea of scary is, right? So maybe he has long hair, and a long haired dude might be scary to some guy, right? Maybe it makes him seem wild and unpredictable. Some women might like that, but just an example, right? So a lot more men are scary because they're unknown, and and so that's part of the left behind there. So people don't have coworkers they're gonna be with for a long time because of the gig economy. So they're not staying in a place for very long. And even if they do, a lot of their coworkers are not, right? So their workplace,
Hmm.
even if they're staying put, their workplace is getting shuffled alive. So they don't have long lasting community bonds there. They don't have other locals that they're getting to know for a particularly long time, often because they're moving along. And even if they aren't, right, if they're the few that are staying put and trying to lay down roots, a lot of their locals and neighbors are. And just think like, what is like the good life, right? Um, what's a simple, easy life that most people could enjoy? I would imagine it's one where, you know, uh, most weekends, if you want to make plans with friends who live in the area with you and just easily throw something together and do something, whether it's at your house or a pub or a restaurant or some sort of local recreation center, that's an easy thing to do almost every weekend or many evenings. And you can just have balance between work and play. Um, that feeds into itself pretty well. And that's almost impossible to do. Like people, like if you actually try to go out and do stuff with folks in person, like
I'm finding
it's
that
crazy.
myself.
And this
That's what
was,
the guy yesterday was saying too.
yeah, and this was tough before COVID, right? I know this as someone who is always throwing out ideas for people to do things. It's so hard to get people to commit to things.
So
And
people are more men are more isolated and more
mhm,
nomadic, so they don't have that like regional stability and community that
right,
like community stability that they once had. So everything's kind of in flux and
right.
dynamic.
And then there are other things too. So I talked about how this can make men strange to women, but another thing is that like a lot of matchmaking, if it didn't like happen at work or school or running into a place you go to a lot, um, people used to set each other up,
It
right?
happened through network, your social network.
Yeah, your
Yeah,
sister, your cousin,
yeah.
um, a female friend who maybe isn't right for you. Like maybe you're a 25-year-old man and you just there's this 35-year-old woman she could introduce you to someone who's about your age, right? Because she knows you, and then you get a stamp of approval from another woman. The one girlfriend I've had, I got because I was introduced basically with a stamp of approval from another woman. I didn't even know it was happening at the time, right? But I later worked out that's exactly what happened, and it was the only time that had ever happened in my life. And sure enough, it was the one instance that resulted in me dating somebody, right? So when these opportunities become more scarce and scarce, and then you have a data set of tens of millions of men, these are the shifts that occur. And so, um, when we talk about left behind, right, it's less money, um, less um, friends and trusted acquaintances in immediate reach, less romantic opportunities, less children, more renting, less home ownership, a lot of these things, right? And less we'll just say emotional validation. So because not only have there been like these hiring and promotion and recruitment campaigns meant to promote women in different workplaces, but a lot of the if you look at the way I think the culture around mental health care um, has also changed dramatically in the 2010s.
What does that mean?
I think people take it more seriously than they used to. So
Oh, in a positive way.
yes, but I also think it is one that has been primarily more oriented toward the mental health of women and the emotional
Abs one
validation.
hundred percent, absolutely 100%. I can speak to that.
All right. So I think there's sort of this bait and switch where people say, oh, take care of your mental health, go see a therapist. But I think it's also that if men have mental health problems, it's told that they're being too greedy, or they
Like
have
too
enough and
toxic.
they're not grateful, or they just need to get over themselves, and that basically it's like mental health, therapy and such is out there for everyone. Everyone should use it except for men, right? And it's like they
Well,
whisper,
they can use it, but it's not designed for them, and so they end up not getting their
yeah,
mental health needs met by the existing system. They're one of the most underserved populations in
yeah,
the mental health system right now because nobody knows how to provide mental health to men effectively.
yeah. And so um, yeah, I think that basically says it's like on paper, mental health is this thing that as a
And
society
the
we want to
APA
ignore.
published those guidelines for men back in
Yeah,
2017 that were very
I
anti-male.
remember that. I remember when it happened, and I remember an acquaintance of mine and I we talked about it, and he said he couldn't believe that they did that because he's like, why? He's like, do they realize what they just did? They basically told every man in the country like that they cannot trust their therapists or their psychologists, that they're just going to get
Yeah,
betrayed by them, essentially. Like he thought it was an incredibly stupid, short-sighted thing to do.
it
That
was.
they permanently crippled their credibility for half the population. And so yeah, like there's this thing where on paper, oh, your mental health and therapy and these resources are out there for everyone. But if you are a guy who tries to use it there's a lot more resistance to it. It's like, why do you need mental health, right? Have you tried not being sexist? This is things like that get said a lot. Not necessarily by therapists, but just in the culture in general. And so, I think um, what a lot of this leads to is when we talk about Lost Boys. Like, what were the Lost Boys in Peter Pan, right? They were these boys that stayed behind in Neverland, and so they never grew up, and they were just permanently infantilized. Now, in real life, we become men. We get grayer, we get wrinklier, maybe we get chubbier if we're not taking care of ourselves, which becomes more likely when we're left behind. Um, and But we don't remain boys, right? But we can have the personality traits of children well into adulthood, right? And, and then we have to think about, well, what's going to happen when the men who were mature and well adjusted, who did not grow up, left behind? What happens when they die off, and the only men left are these ones who are, or the most of the men left over are these ones who are, you know, being infantilized well into their adult life. How does society run then? I don't think that's some of the concern there, right? And so those are all, I think, the things that go into it. Whatever we may think about what led to it, what to do about it, whether anything can be done about it.
Maybe we need YouTube dating
Maybe.
or networking. Let me offer a data point from my end
Mm-hmm.
to kind of counter all that, because I was convinced there was this big men's mental health crisis too. And so that's one reason I started everything. I started men's groups. I started my practice. I started this channel. The men are not wrapped around the block trying to get any kind of service or mental health. So if there is a crisis, when you do offer an alternative to what's out there, they're not showing up for it. So I don't know if there's actually that crisis or if it's a social media fiction.
Well, if they're not showing up for it, it could be because they've turned their they turned the idea of it off already. After seeing things like what the AMA put out, or was it the AMA, or what was it, the APA? What
The
was it?
APA, yeah, that was
The
I
APA.
think 2017.
Yeah. So I mean, that sets a tone, right? And it's not like uh, there's been any kind of retraction of that since then. I think that's just sort of been the standard. Um, I've seen a lot of posts on Reddit of guys who tried going to therapists, and the therapist was clearly like some left wing woman who just interpreted um, everything he said in a bad way, or everything he shared in a bad way. Now I will say that um, and I've made use of mental health resources, and there's a free clinic provided by the University of North Carolina, and they have a mental health subsection of it. So I have gone to that on and off just to check in with myself as far back as I want to say like 2018, and I've had by this point 4 different therapists, all of them women, right? And none of them ever disregarded my feelings. So I felt that um, I feel like maybe the first couple I wasn't quite as candid about some things as I would have liked to have been, but I have found that when I've been very clear about what the source of my frustration was, they have not been resistant to it, or tried to shame me, or tried to be like, Joe, you suffer from toxic masculinity. None of that stuff, right? So my experiences have been good, but I still see there's a lot of men that clearly they didn't run into that, and they ran into exactly the horror story I imagined, and I suspect there's a lot of men who aren't pursuing it because they're afraid of that. Plus, like in my case, I got to do it for free. If it costs money to go to a therapist who may be against you, I think that's another deterrent. Especially if it's in a gig economy and healthcare benefits are not part of your pay, and so you're going to have to go out of pocket, and it's just you have to think about it like that. And it's like, am I going to be happy with
Are women getting it free, or they're having to pay it too, right? But they just have better
they
benefits
might?
and resources now.
I think they have less reason to suspect that they're going to be unhappy with the return on their investment, right? Whereas I think men,
Less risk. It's
yes,
higher risk for men.
right, exactly. And it's like you could spend the money on that, and then get a bad result, or you can spend the money on something that you like, right? And even if, let's say, it could be alcohol, right? A lot of
Or
men like to
weed.
drink. Yeah, so I, they're getting bad results for the stuff that's not good for them, but they at least are going to be happy with it they got out of it versus the therapist.
I
So
don't know. That's a pretty cynical view of men.
what?
That they're going to be content with alcohol because they're not sure if they can get good therapy.
I'm
I
talking
don't
about.
know that most men are going to settle for
I'm
that.
not saying most men will do that, but I'm saying that, like, because obviously I don't drink alcohol, right? Um, but like that's just sort of like as one alternative that some men will utilize, right? Like that's a more appealing to some men clearly than alcohol. Like I know of more men who will recreationally drink alcohol than who go to therapy. Um, and so some of that is because alcohol is more established in the general culture, right? It goes back to medieval times, right? Mind your pints and quarts is a very old saying. Um, in fact, I think it was the friars who came up with that. But um, uh, I think that's the thing. I think another thing too is that since it's let's let's talk about what I did mention though. All four of my um, they were graduate students who were supervised by a doctor, but all four of them were women, right? And mental health is one of those areas that's heavily represented by women, or heavily consists of women. I don't think represent is the right. Represent gets used too much.
It's a
Um,
matriarchy. At
I think
least
it's like what
the mental health systems I've been part of.
I think about. So in the mental health field, depending on what you count, what positions you count as being the mental health field, I think about 70 to 80% of them are women. Is that correct?
Seems like it. What,
Okay,
like just subjectively from
I'm trying to recall the
my
data. I've seen the data
participation in it.
before, but I can't remember exact numbers. But I
They
think
they
it's
hire they
really,
hire a lot fresh out of college, social work programs,
yeah,
psychology programs. A lot of them are large, heavily young female.
yeah. And I think it's a similar thing. Like when you look at a career that's heavily represented by men, or heavily consists of men, we'll say, like engineering, right? It's because engineering is something that's more naturally appealing to men, and then things like the mental health field, you know, across female populations is more appealing as well. So you have these um, overrepresentations of either sex in those types of fields. Um, and so it may be the case that uh, men just feel it's unlikely that someone's going to get them. If you look at like, I think one thing that I've tried to think about over the last couple of years is, what male bonding looks like, what male mentorship looks like, um, and uh, it's like when you think about like the difference between, like, for example, if you just get back down to parenting, like when you look at a healthy relationship between um, a father and his children versus a mother and her children, like, what are the kinds of things they tend to do? And one thing that's often been talked about is, men will engage in like rough and tumble play, right? They'll wrestle and roughhouse with their children a bit. They'll be physical, but they'll also tend to be the stern disciplinarians, right? Like, I've heard it more often the case than the other way around, that if the children are misbehaving and they're not listening to the mother, usually when the father asserts himself, that's when the children listen.
When your father gets, so wait till your father gets home.
Exactly, right? I mean, I've never heard of a situation, anecdotally or what I've observed, where oh, wait till your mother gets home, right? It's the father somehow has this natural authority presence. And maybe it goes into like men seeming more scary. They
Well,
can
he's
pull
the
out.
ass beater
Well, yeah, he can
too.
pull
He's
out
going
it.
to be able to
He can pull out his dark side,
put.
right? Um, and uh, and when you look at like the way male friends bond together, or in adulthood, when men have mentors, men will joke around with each other. They'll tease each other, in a friendly way, right? They'll do the banter. And some guys will even, still roughhouse a bit or wrestle, or they'll do physical things, right? They'll test each other. They'll be like, they'll race each other, even if they don't like, actually try to scrap on the ground. They'll do things like race each other, or they'll be like, oh, I bet I can catch more fish than you. And they do things like that. And they compete with each other, but often in a healthy way to sort of raise each other up. Which I think a lot of women often view it as competition to try and keep each other down. But in the right way, it's a thing where they both grow through, mutual, like, reinforced competition, and essentially as a form of accountability. And when you take what all the social trends I had mentioned before, and you have them become significantly less common to the point that these things don't exist for men at all, those sorts of relationships evaporate. Like, one thing I thought was interesting is like, um, when I was looking at the Call of Duty games, particularly the Modern Warfare series, which is like a trilogy. And I'm talking about the first Call of Duty Modern Warfare series, not the new one, because I'm not familiar with that. Um, there's sort of these, it's all male characters. And over the course of the series, you see how they get close and the way they express emotions with each other. So, like when characters die and stuff, after they've gotten to know each other so much, there's a certain way they express grief, which I think is interesting because it's just a shooter game, right? But the way that it is chosen to be conveyed to make it believable is interesting. One thing that the commanders often do when speaking to the more junior members of their unit that they have been training and leading, is they'll call them son, right? And so they often, the framing in those character relationships in these stories is often sort of like a father-son relationship. And it's based on this idea of toughness, but over time, a genuine love comes out of it. And it's sort of like a relationship that I don't think that kind of relationship I like, because the Call of Duty games were very popular games. The Modern Warfare games were very popular games. They really helped
Do you
launch the
think
Call of
that
Duty franchises.
do you think video games have the potential to fill in for the mentorship, or at least that kind of culture that men are no longer getting? Is that
Well,
an option?
when I'm just talking about the narrative decisions and why these they're popular games. The characters were very popular. Like Captain Price was a very popular video game character in the Call of Duty series, and he is the one that leads the British special, the British Special Forces unit. Um, and he has those relationships with his men, where he's sort of like this fatherly figure who like keeps them in order, but also looks out for them. And he's um, serious about the mission, but he's very loyal to his men, and he, puts their well-being. He makes their well-being a priority, and he doesn't treat his men like they're disposable. Um, and so there's this camaraderie, basically, is the way it's portrayed. And I think that's an important part of male bonding is camaraderie. And I think that there's hints of that in the way fathers and sons bond with each other. And a lot of male bonding is modeled on that. And it requires, because I think that's often of a very physical nature. It requires things like close communities and regular iteration, like regular interaction, for that to be maintained. Um, and to the extent that men have been able to find some sort of companionship online, it's usually through gaming. It's usually through a very team-based gaming where they're supposed to like interact with each other a lot. One thing that has been noted is that as smartphones and social media became more common, this was something that Jonathan Haidt and Greg Luciano talked about in The Coddling of the American Mind, is how depression rates for young people increased, but they actually increased more for young women and girls than for men. And that's because women were using
Especially liberal white women.
yeah, and it's because women and girls were using social media more just to sort of be on social media, and they're just seeing pictures of other women and feeling inadequate. Whereas men tend to use the internet for gaming, and they use it for cooperative teamwork stuff, right? that's even what I've been doing lately, right? Like I've been playing Minecraft and coordinating with a friend of mine. We did a bunch of mining together, and it was just very fun with me to have like a shared project with somebody. And I think about like a lot of the other really fun gaming experiences I've had. That's usually been when I've been playing with a friend, pretty much almost always another guy, and we're just sort of pursuing some sort of arbitrary nerdy goal together.
That reminds me, not Laz and I are supposed to game today. We'll see how that goes.
Yeah. And so, but it used to be like, guys could go fishing together, or they could, go to the range together, or they go hunting together, or, they would do more than just sit and talk.
Yeah. So male bonding, like community and male
Mhm.
bonding, mentorship, and like initiatory paths to some kind. Because adulthood is defined. It's like group defined. Each group or culture is going to have their own version of what constitutes an adult in that group, who's mastered the necessarily skills or norms to be considered advanced in that group.
Mhm.
And so, depending on what group you have military, you have academia. I guess you have like some corporations still provide something like that. But with outside of that, you talked about the gig economy, the nomadism.
Mhm.
There's not really groups for men to belong to with very specific defined paths into the group that put them at a certain rank of mastery at some point, which we could
Mhm.
call adulthood. So that's where we get this lostness. We're lost
Right.
because we don't have a home, and we don't have a initiatory path into that home to let us know when we've achieved whatever that group's version of adulthood or mastery is.
Right. And while there have been these groups that are made to support women, they can be happen within workplaces, right? Like established and supported by the employer. If you try to make a group for men, what's going to happen?
Dude, I could tell you what's going to happen. I was told when I lived in Seattle, I wanted to do a men's support group, and I was told by my roommate that if I attempted to do that here, I would be ostracized. I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, men can't get together. He's like, are you serious? In a town like Seattle, do you think you can have a group of just men? And that made me want to do it even more. But that was his reaction to the idea of having a group of. I wanted to do a mental health group of only men, and he absolutely freaked out. He said they will never let that happen here. And I
Yeah.
did that. I did one stream that was a male only panel, and I got trolled by somebody pretending to be a woman that had a problem with it. And exactly what I wasn't worried that it would happen because I didn't think it would, but I was being naive because there was a lot of pushback on me having that all male panel that I
Mhm.
didn't foresee necessarily from this community. So there is something about men gathering together in their own spaces that people who are not men have a lot of resistance to and try to actively interfere with.
Trying to catch up with the chat here. I was not really looking at it as I was talking.
Does
Okay.
that mean you weren't listening to me?
I heard what you said about how you tried to make that
Yeah,
group. Yeah.
I was reinforcing what you're saying about the difficulty. For some reason, men trying to do their own thing together
Yeah.
raises a lot of resistance from society. But so did gays try to do their own thing together back in the day, and that didn't stop us. So I think men still need to associate with each other and
Yeah.
ignore all the people that are not men whining about it.
Yeah. I think that's something too. Is like,
But you're saying it had workplace support, like it had actual institutional support for women to form these groups.
yeah. When
But
I
that
worked
if
at
a
Fidelity,
males in a workplace tried to form a boys club,
yeah, like
that
when I worked at Fidelity, there were these affinity groups, right? And you had and these are like set up and supported by Fidelity. Um, they would like be on the calendar, like the corporate calendar, and there'd be like signs up saying on this day is going to be this affinity group is meeting, or it's this day. They had in their calendar like this is like Asia Pacific Appreciation Month or something. And so it was more than just Pride, right? And more than just Black History Month. It's just every month is a thing. And they had affinity groups for like sexual LGBT minorities. They had affinity groups for the different racial and ethnic groups that I mentioned, except for one, of course, as you can probably guess. And then they had groups for women, um, but that nothing for men. And I can't imagine that you could have made something for men there and that it would have gone over well. But then, um, I think so. It's not only that there's these things that are specifically being oriented toward women, but if an attempt by men is made to do something, it gets shot down, right? One thing I've noticed is that the Boy Scouts made a change saying that they'll allow girls to join. I don't think I've heard anything about the Girl Scouts saying that they're going to let boys join. And as far as I can tell, I don't think there are many guys who want to join the Girl Scouts. But for some reason, I can imagine that girls would just want to be in the Boy Scouts, and they feel like they're entitled to be in the Boy Scouts or something. And so it's like the idea of like a gentleman's club is almost offensive now.
But that doesn't mean that men should stop having gentlemen's clubs. And if I were an employer, if I were in that situation, two things would happen. I would be raising every kind of unholy hell you could imagine to get my men's group. And if they're letting all these other groups have their affinity groups, they have to let men or white people have their affinity groups as well. I don't see how they can get away with not. So there'd be a fight. And I don't need an employer to form an infinity group. Men can get together on their own independently and form infinity groups. So, like, you don't need permission from some existing authority or entity to form a group. Men can spontaneously start forming their groups. That's what they used to do in the past.
Yeah, and I would say doing it at work, like through like a workplace club, like at Fidelity, is probably not great. In fact, I thought that was weird. Like I saw the affinity groups and I didn't think, oh, that's nice. I thought this is weird. This is extremely strange. This is the company like having too much of a role in people's like lives because they were hosting like watch parties and stuff. It's basically like your own hobbies become part of your work and stuff. And Fidelity was a great place to work in a lot of ways, but that was just strange to me. Like they do a lot to support their employees, I would say. But I don't think there was anything. It was because of anything weird about them in particular. But I do think it's sort of like reflecting the way general culture is changing. That those things just seem like good ideas. But for yeah, so it's definitely it's difficult to see what the root can be because any man who tries to take initiative and organize something like this is going to be met with
Yeah,
resistance.
well, I'm gonna say this right now. Anytime men want an all male panel, you're welcome to one here. I've said that before. I'm willing to do all male panels. So if there's a need for one, we can have a regular all male panel, or if you just need spontaneously just a panel with all men, let me know, and I can make that happen here. Nobody's gonna stop me from doing it.
Yeah, and I'll say this too. Like I think one thing that men who want to do something about it need to realize is that they need to forget about the haters and the resistance and just do
Yeah,
it
yeah.
because
That's. I mean,
I could say that going along with what people want has never rewarded men. Like men do not
that's
get
what
rewarded.
the gays could teach them. That's what we did.
Yeah, like so going along with what the feminist activist wants, the ones in particular who hate men, giving them their half of things never gets you your half. It's always going to be a one-sided relationship, and don't pick one-sided relationships.
Yeah.
Because I can tell you that um, no matter how much I have been respectful to women and shown this, the same deference for them as I would a man in the same situation, no woman who's ever accused me of being a sexist or misogynistic has cared about that. Even if they knew that I did these things, they have never cared about it. They do not care. So haters are going to hate. You can't please them. No matter how much you try to make society equal for women, they are never going to believe it. And so instead of trying to satisfy that side of society that is just perennially and pathologically unhappy, you have to figure out what do I want want to other men that I know want, and what can we do to achieve it? And you basically have to say like, hey, they're going to hate us no matter what, and it's just part of life. There's no version of it. It's very unlikely that there's a version of this anyway,
That's
where
what I've been saying.
men get to do what they want, have their thing, and then everyone's okay with it, and we're all just one big utopia. That's probably not going to happen. If it does happen, it'll be several years down the road. Probably not with the society in which we live right now. Um, and so, I think another thing too is, and this is a challenge, is a result of a lot of men being left behind. And some of them have become more sexist and misogynistic as a result. Is it any surprise that men who have been treated with hostility by women throughout their living memory would develop the similar feelings toward women? Imagine, because I heard a lot of young men saying who like they voted for Trump, like people who were approached by reporters, like young men, asked, "Well, why did you vote for Trump?" And what a lot of them said is that we have been blamed our whole lives for things that other men who lived before us have done. We didn't do any of it, and we basically don't get to take off as an adults. We are just, you know, have our feet nailed to the floor the moment we learn to stand, and we're supposed to be okay with that. Like we want to live our lives. We just want to be normal people, and um, so when a lot of men, I think, when treated that way, they're not just going to be like, "Oh, this sucked." It's going to be, "Oh, this sucks, and I hate women," right? And so,
That's
and I get it. It's like I can get why, like I get why there, for example, why there are black people who don't like white people, right? Knowing the history of this country, I know why such people would exist, and I know why, if they run into me and they can't tell me apart from the worst of white people, they might err on the side of caution and with that spite. At least I get it from, like, in the sense of I understand the basic cause and effect of why it happened. I am not surprised that such a thing has happened. Do I like it when I find myself in such a situation? No, but I get why it happens. Right? It's no surprise to me that in a country where crosses will get burned in people's yards, some people are not happy to see white guys.
but no one's burning crosses today,
No, but what I am saying is
so they
that
can't separate the white people from today from the cross burners of the past.
clearly some people can't, right? That's what I'm saying. So the fact that it's
I,
happened,
I
right?
think that's a
I'm not.
defect in their thinking.
Well, I'm not saying that like this is well reasoned, right? What I am saying is that because bad things have happened before, I'm not surprised that there are certain results that are still happening as a result of today, right? Like it doesn't surprise me. If those things had never happened, it would be a lot more surprising if people felt these ways they do about like white guys, right? But they did happen. So I'm not surprised that people continue to have ill feelings over things that have happened
But
before.
if
And
people have ill feelings toward me as an individual based on something that I didn't do because of some group they're associating me with, I just don't think those are very intelligent people.
probably not, right? Which is why I said, don't try to please the haters, because if even if everything that the activist types say about the past is true, if they're gonna let that cause them to be upset forever, regardless of what you try and do to make
Yeah,
a
they're
brighter
the
world,
authors of their own hate because they're telling
yeah,
themselves a narrative
yeah,
that's
yeah.
keeping
Eventually,
that hate going.
eventually, you just have to stop worrying about pleasing them and just be like, okay, they're just somebody who will never be pleased, and they probably would have not been happy even if the world had,
I
you
can't
know,
believe anyone tried to please him in the first place.
yeah. So that's all you can do, and so there's this balancing act where we do have to figure out how to, if we want to do anything about it, um, create essentially things like men's spaces
Hmm.
where, but it's mostly about what is good for men rather than getting back at women. And a lot of stuff that I see, like if you look at like, people who are popular in social media, a lot of it is like, it cannot separate, it has trouble separating male improvement from, um, being angry and hateful toward women.
Well, I can say that I've been doing men's work for years, and almost none of it. I can't even remember an instance when it was about getting back at women.
Well, maybe in your work, that is true. And I'd be surprised if your work was about getting back at women. But like, for example, the fact that someone like Andrew Tate is popular, um, and a significant amount of his message is, men getting ahead at the expense of women. I think that sort of is reflective of how young men have come to feel. The fact that he's considered a
But
role
I think
model.
that message has purchased because it seems like women are getting ahead at the expense of men. So it's a
Yeah,
natural, like they're going to natural, that
exactly,
net message is going to appeal to people that see women getting ahead at their expense.
exactly. And so that's why I was saying it's very this is easy, and that if you want to have a successful, I think, men support project, you have to figure out a way to for men to be good in and of themselves and not worry about what are the prospects or successes of women. You
Yeah,
know,
I would agree.
because otherwise, I think it's just it. And that if that's the case, battle of the sexes never ends, and it's just always going to be this tit for tat thing. And long term, I can't imagine a solution where you start bringing back the gentlemen's clubs, and then while they're meeting, they're talking about how little they think of women or something like that. And in the old days, that was a thing in gentlemen's clubs. Like they would say disparaging things about women. That's certainly
But
more
women
like
say the
older men.
same shit about men when they get together. I think adults have the right to say whatever they want when they're together. I don't think anyone needs to be policing what men and women are saying about each other. If men want to vent about women, that's fine. Women do it about men, I
There's
guarantee
venting
you.
about it, and then there is I'm talking about like really old gentlemen's club, like women can't be authors because women are too stupid to write,
Well,
like
that's
shit like
just
that.
that people can have all kind of crazy beliefs and ideas. That's not. I don't care if a bunch of old men get together and smoke cigars and say women can't be authors. Meanwhile, there's a ton of women writing books like that. What is that? What is that hurting?
Well, what it hurts is because older men did it, and
Because here
target.
come the Karens to police the speech of the men.
But what it hurts is because older men did it. There are targets on younger men, right? So I'm just saying, like, if we care about like the
By
feedback loop.
by by idiot. Only an idiot would put a target on a younger man because some old man in some private club said that about women. Most adults, I think, would be able to separate that from. Of course, women can be authors, and not assume that young men don't think women can be authors because of these few old men. I think the answer is education. Educating these dummies that think that kind of stupid, shallow stuff in the first place, not preventing men from saying what they want when they're in private. You know me, I'm very anti-policing of the speech. So
Yeah, but
if old men want to get together and say dumb shit, I think in a country like America they have the right to do that.
okay. Well, and if that's what ends up happening when men's groups form again, and if I were to go to one and that's what I primarily saw, I would just stop going. I
Yeah,
just
and
don't.
you have the right to do that. I'm saying
Yeah,
like none of the groups have I that I've been involved in have ever said anything like that.
yeah. But I am saying like if we're thinking long term, right? Like, yeah, short term, who should police conversations? But if we're just thinking long term, what kind of domino effects am I creating, and will I be happy with those? That's just the point I'm raising.
Yeah, I honestly don't care what men talk about when they get together in private. If they're not actively taking some kind of harmful action against somebody. If they're just sitting there talking, drinking and smoking, or sitting around a campfire talking, I don't care what they say. I'm not as concerned or frightened by speech as other people seem to be.
But I am saying that like uh, nothing I've said has suggested or implied that policing would need to occur. Um, what I am saying is that the organic um, growth of such like movements to make spaces for men and the like and create male support. Long term, if they want to be successful, they would need to be like this. It's hard to get anywhere if if there's a sense of making enemies in the process, right? Um, Especially when the enemy making part is not necessary. Um,
Yeah, I
and
guess it would depend on their goals.
Yeah, so it maybe is the case that you make that this isn't avoidable, and that if you get men or women together, they're just going to complain about the other sex, and no amount of good intentions is going to change that, and that all the sexes will never end. Maybe that doesn't ever go
I mean,
away.
I do that openly on here. I do all my complaining live on stream in front of the world to see. So about women, about white people, neurotypical. So everybody knows what my complaints are about all the different groups that I've encountered.
Yeah, but even then, yours are nuanced. Like you're not like abandoning
You
entire
don't think a
demographics.
lot of men's conversations are nuanced?
So I think if somebody says women can't be authors because women are too stupid to write, I don't think that's nuanced. I
Yeah, I've
think that
never heard anybody say that.
well, I'm talking about way back in the day, right
But
before
we're
you and I
not
were even
back in the
born.
day.
I know, but I am saying that because stuff like that did happen, and absolutely did happen, right? Um, there's this domino effect where a lot of why men are left behind now has even occurred, right? So we can do this we can do this like cycle of things like strong men create good times create weak men create hard times create strong men. We can have a cycle like that where maybe it's not that exact thing, but something starts with it's constantly looping like that. If that's inevitable, so be it. But if it's not inevitable, maybe whatever the happy state is, we can think about what are the right incentives that maintain it. What is a where people like I think
That seems like social engineering. Like you don't need to incentivize anything. Just let men be themselves. As long as they're not hurting any. I'd say the same for any group. I'd
well,
say
okay,
let women be themselves.
as long as they're not hurting anybody,
And
whether or
words
not
don't hurt. Words have the power you give them. So if they're just sitting around talking, they're not hurting anybody. They don't need to be incentivized. They don't need to be engineered. They don't need to be held accountable for what old men in the past said in their private groups. Any of that.
okay,
Just
as
give
long as
them
they're
the
not hurting
space to
anybody,
talk and be men and be
think
themselves.
think about that though, Jeff. As long as they're not hurting anybody, whether or not people hurt each other is a direct result of incentive.
Physical harm, not words. I don't consider men sitting around chatting harm. A Karen would, but I don't consider that harm.
I don't
They
either.
have
This is
individual men have to take a specific act for it to be harm.
I don't think the words are harm either, right? But what I am saying is that um, whether or not people do physical harm is a direct result of incentives that exist in that
No, I
time.
don't think it's a direct result. I think if anything, it's an indirect result. I think the person doing the physical harm is responsible for the harm, not the men saying stuff in a group.
So it's a simple fact that violent crime has been on the decline for several years now, as much as a century, and that's been as the incentives change, right? So when there's more abundance, and
That's your claim. I don't know that I accept that as the gospel truth. That's one theory of why it's there's nothing concrete enough to say violent crime has been down because of this one thing, and we can definitively make that statement. There's just not. There's
okay,
no way
well,
to say that.
the facts we do have is that there's less scarcity. Um, Violence is less necessary to get by.
And it seems
You
like
know, and
it's on the increase lately.
well, one thing that has become more common is like for example, like the breakdown of familial structures, and that could also be part of how young men are left behind. Is a lot more of them today grow up without their fathers. Um, so not only do they lack the
Are a positive male role model, if not
yeah
necessarily their biological father.
right, and so um, um, there's a lot of that going on, but like like a lot of places, like a lot of parts of the world that have honor cultures, these are worlds where there are not central authorities like a stable government to enforce deals and contracts and make sure that things can
Well,
be settled
I
with
come
mercy.
from somewhere with an honor culture. We have all of that.
Yeah. So and in the South, right? That was a thing that the parts of the South that were more populated. Um, they had the South had a much more Scotch Irish influence, and Whereas the North in the United States was more had a more Anglo-Saxon um, settlement, and so um, the English were more. We'll just say that they had a more direct relationship to a modern state, and their the idea of like Englishness being synonymous with Britishness, sort of references to that. There's you think of it like an English upper class. You don't really think of a Scottish upper class. Scotland and Ireland were more rural. They were poorer. Scotland, they had the clan culture. Right? Like the word clan comes from Scottish people, and they had their herding culture, and basically like if one clan tried to like steal sheep or threaten their flocks or just do anything to mess up that order, the way that was enforced was clan warfare. Um, and there was not like a reliable public authority to settle disputes in
Well,
that. And
thank
so,
goodness we have that now in the modern world, even in
right.
the South.
And so that was brought into the South, and that's why a lot of it is preserved there because it was a centuries old culture that was brought in. Is it as extreme in the South today as would have been like during the height of like the Scottish honor culture? No, but there are elements of it, right? It's the thing where we can say it's not surprising that this is more common in the South, given what had happened before, right? Versus in the North. I think one area too as well where the honor culture is strong is in if we talk about part of the South, African American culture, because they have never been able until
The
very
gang
recently,
banging, gang culture.
right? So gang culture part of this, right? But even before that,
I do
right?
want to make. I do want to point out there's a big cultural difference between rural Southern blacks and urban
I would
blacks too.
agree.
You see much less of that gang culture in the rural black culture.
But I think a lot of the gang culture is built on the honor culture that formed where African Americans had to come up with their own cultural norms of enforcement because they did not rely or trust the public authorities much because public authorities were literally racist against them, right? Not systemically racist, but like the racism was the statute. And they were not going to go, to the sheriff that was elected by 90% white people um, for to resolve their disputes. They weren't going to trust the judge to give them a fair day in court. And so they settled it amongst themselves. And right, so it's a direct result of incentives. I think as the more people
You
have
keep
purchased,
saying direct result of incentives, but incentive is only one factor and one influence. So
it is.
I don't think it's as direct as you keep claiming.
I mean, I just think if you go from one thing being a major trend to another, and you look at the incentives that change, then yeah, it's a direct result of incentives. Are there other
That's
factors?
your in your
Are
mind.
there
It's
other
that.
factors that influence it? Yes, but direct result of incentives does not mean it's an exclusive result of incentives, right? It just means that when you change the incentives, you change what happens dramatically. And
Maybe.
so if people have more incentive not to be violent to be successful, then you'll see a lot more people do it.
I think the amount of violent potential in people is kind of innate, and you can incentivize the expression or suppression of it, but you can't incentivize the violence itself out of humans. That's always there under the surface, waiting to
So
bubble up.
we have the potential, but whether or not people are going to make that decision, whether or not they think, not only is
And
this a good
now we're going
idea,
to get into nature nurture. I can already
you know,
see where this is going.
whether or not this
And
is,
nurture is incentive.
um, yeah, incentives is the nurture part of it, right?
Right, and that debate is by far not settled. No scientist can say where the line ends between the two. So this is all just assertion,
I mean, okay, so
and
ISIS,
it operates at the individual level too. So it's going to be different in every individual.
okay, so ISIS puts out propaganda bragging about massacring civilians, even taking women and girls as sex slaves that you could just brutally rape. And then you have young Muslim men in Western countries like America, the UK, hearing about that and saying, you know what, I'm going to go join ISIS.
Every single one?
No, but I'm saying is like, you had a system over in the Middle East while ISIS was at its peak, where the incentives they created is like, hey, doing this to women and girls, that's good. This is, you're getting rewarded, right? It's a complete inversion of what's over here. And you had a lot of that occurring over there in places controlled by ISIS, and you don't have nearly as much of it occurring, in places like the West. To the extent that that kind of abuse happens, they have to go through efforts to conceal it. You have to do like trafficking and stuff. It's much more cumbersome to get away with it, right? And that's part of what deters it as well, right? It's a negative incentive. So my simple point is that incentives matter. If we're talking about an issue that deals with,
I'm not saying they don't matter. It's the dogmatism of like this directly due to this one incentive. It's. I'm not saying they're not an influence or a factor.
well,
I just can't be as black and white and definitive about it as you seem to
what
be.
is
But I think that's a minor quibble anyway. I don't think it matters for the larger point.
I'm a little surprised that when I say directly, you go, like I gave you a little electric shock almost. But
that was your impression. But
yeah,
it just seems dogmatic to say like direct influence. And I'm very alert to dogma, I guess, being an empiricist and a rationalist and very scientifically minded.
mm-hmm. Yeah, and so and I said that a lot because in the decisions I make, I think about when I am interacting with others. I often think about it like, if I do action A, B, or C, what different incentives am I creating for other folks? Like, if I'm not
Oh
happy
Lord, are you
with something in my
serious?
life, of course I think about that,
Oh my
Jeff. Of
God.
course I think about that. Why wouldn't I think
That's
about
a whole. We should do that as a topic. That fascinates me.
why wouldn't I am in an environment with hundreds of other individuals around me all the time, and if the quality of my life is going to depend on the decisions they make in response to what I do, right? So I have to think about the incentives.
Maybe, but you're not in control of that. Like you make the choices you make, and then they make their choices in response.
True, but if the choice they make is, I'm going to shoot Joe in the forehead, and it's a specific choice they make because of something that I did, I should maybe think about that, right? Because I bet I can tempt somebody to shoot me in the forehead. I bet if I make the right choices myself, I can do that.
So is that a day-to-day example? What's a day-to-day example that I could relate to more?
Okay, so when I was here at the coffee shop, and that guy confronted me, right? Said that he didn't like that I was too loud. I told him it's a public place, and then I put my headphones back on, and I returned to our call, and I didn't yell at him, and I didn't say, who do you think you are? Go fuck yourself. I didn't say that, right? I could have done that, and then he could have got angrier and physically threatening, and then I could have.
Were you
responded.
running this through your head at the time? Like, here's all
Yeah.
my options, and I can incentivize this, that, or the other.
Yeah, because this is America, right? What's our Second Amendment? Remind me what that does again.
The guns, the pow
Okay.
pows.
So for all I know, he's got a gun, and if I piss him off, he'll pull it out and shoot me dead.
You really think that?
Pete, that happens all
I
the
would,
fucking time.
if I was sitting at a Starbucks or a civilized coffee shop and like civilized, it would never cross my mind that somebody's about to pull a gun and shoot me. But I did get my nose busted with the same line of thinking. So
yeah, and then even as it's happening, you're like, why is this person hitting me?
Right,
Is this really
yeah.
happening? Right. So I'm aware that if you go out enough, eventually you'll walk by people who can be provoked into murder just if you piss them off.
I don't know. I feel like if anybody would have provoked it by now, it would have been me.
Maybe,
and believe me,
like,
I've had people that probably wanted to do it. I have people making murder videos about me as it is.
I have seen murder videos on the internet where people just get into an argument, and in the heat of anger, they just pull out a gun and kill the other person. It was just, if they had simply not run into
Do
each
you
other
think
that
that's the norm? Do you leave your house every day worrying that you're going to set off one of those people and they'd get murdered? That is not the norm I leave my house with. I think there's
I
a whole range of like options and conflict resolution, like alternatives and scenarios that can happen before somebody pulls out a gun and shoots me for
no,
something that I randomly do or say in public.
I don't wake up in the morning with cold sweats thinking, oh my God, I might get murdered today. But um, I am aware of the things that can kill me. Like, why do I look both ways? Because I cross the street. Because I know that a car, could run me over. And am I in a constant fear that I'm about to be hit by a car wherever I go? But I know that, no, but I know in the right situations, I can make getting hit by a car more likely, right? And so, if I'm, out in public and I run into a total stranger, um, and depending on some other, factors we might use to illustrate the example better, um, the possibility of someone getting angry and being violent, maybe even pulling out a gun and shooting me, is on the table, right? I know I live in a country with the Second Amendment, right?
I know,
This
but I
is
still don't. Even
this
being
isn't
from the South, I don't even worry about it.
this isn't a
I've
country
lived in New
where
Orleans and never worried about it.
they've taken away the guns, right? Part of the whole
Yeah, but
thing
it
of being
just
here is
it
people
never
have their guns.
crosses my mind to worry that somebody might have a gun or shoot
Yeah,
me.
yeah, and so there are some people who pick fights, right? Like in the street, like, oh yeah, you wanna throw down, and then they, try to attack someone. The person pulls out a gun and shoots them. And to me, it just doesn't make sense to live in a country that is known for its defense of the right to bear firearms, not just arms, but we're talking about firearms, and then not think you could be shot if you cross the wrong person, right? Like that's
That's
just
not a fear that I carry around with me. I just
that,
don't.
that's part of why people have guns. It's so that if they feel like they need to defend themselves, they have it. And your miscommunication with somebody might make somebody think that they have to defend themselves, right? You don't control that either. So it's just I'm
Right.
aware
So
of
what
things
can I
like
do
that.
about it to begin with? If they're that crazy, I'm not going to see it coming.
You figure that out, right? You figure that out, Jeff. But what I'm saying is
Well, you
like,
were talking about incentive structure, so I assume you have some insight to shed on it since you
well,
actually do this process.
if I become an angry, screaming asshole, I am much more likely to make somebody think that I'm about to be violent, and therefore they might take preemptive violent action
Well,
against me.
good thing I don't become a crazy screaming asshole.
All right, so the
Maybe that's
the
why I
more
don't worry about it.
muted my response can be, the less I escalate, the less I create incentive for people to feel like they need to do that, where it becomes like this prisoner's dilemma, this game theory where you got to have the first mover's advantage. All right, and so maybe I could not do that my whole life and still never run into a problem, right? Because I'd have to run into um, the people who would, for whom failing to do that would be a mistake, right? Um, losing control of myself for a moment and freaking out and shouting and being a public disruption, whether or not that's a mistake, can be dependent on who's present and who's going to make it a mistake, right? Who's going to essentially punish it by inflicting something upon me. And so it's just more looking at the nature of the situation, right? Like you look at it,
I
Jeff, and you
guess
said
how do
that,
you judge that? Because that's a subjective call, and maybe I'm more naive and believe that we live in more of a high trust society than we actually do.
yeah. So like one thing I often note with you, Jeff, is like I'll say something and you'll be like, but that's on them. That's their responsibility, or it's their fault that happens, or they're the ones who should be doing that. They shouldn't be policing you, right? You always look at it as like everyone's individual and they're morally responsible for themselves, and things
Is
are
that
not
not the
immoral.
case?
I'm not saying that's not the case, right? I'm just talking about um, when I go around and look at things, I don't look around and think, oh, there's all these individuals around me who are responsible for themselves, um, and are gonna need to make morally correct decisions. Um, I look at it as, I am in this environment, and this environment has these properties. If I interact with it in this way, what things are going to happen, or are more or less likely to happen,
Yeah, I
right?
don't think about any of that. I just
Yeah,
act, and then I deal with the consequences.
yeah, and
But I
I have
also don't think that I don't assume they're going to make the morally correct choice every time, but I assume that in modern American society, at the level of civilization we've achieved, it's not in most people's interest to escalate conflict, so that out of just self-interest, most people are going to try to stay out of any unnecessary conflict. And it seems to work.
Right.
Most people do.
Right, because they have the right incentives to do so. So, I'd be much more worried about pulling out a gun and shooting me, you know, in a fit of anger in, say, like the year 1800 than I would today.
Yeah,
Right.
maybe so. Or maybe even in certain like areas of the country, or there are certain areas of New Orleans where I might feel in fact, okay, I have an example for you from my own life. Growing up gay, there were certain areas that you found yourself in at different times where you just knew you had to kind of tamp it down a bit, that it was risky to be as openly gay as you could be in other areas. And I don't know how you knew, you just intuitively, instinctively knew this is a danger zone. Don't push it here. And I was always able to do that. And it was not really anything conscious. Like when I was aware I was in those situations, I did kind of alter my presentation just a bit. And there's areas in New Orleans where I'd be much more worried about like guns. Someone's going to pull out a gun, but those are not areas that I go in.
Hmm. Yeah. So, to connect it to like the topic again, right? Loop it back around. Right. Like those are the things that I think
Oh, I
about.
thought
Like,
that was connected.
well, maybe for the sake of the people watching, making sure their train of thought still following the original point.
I
Um,
trust my viewers are intelligent enough to see the relation. I mean, that's exactly what we were talking about, the different
well,
environments and the different subjective like threat level and risk factors. And I gave concrete examples from my life, and I don't want it to be dismissed as irrelevant or feel like my audience has to be babysat. So the autistic host is not quite aware that what he's saying is not connected to the conversation. I think it is, and I think most of my audience can see that what I said was relevant. And
so
if
I
not, they can type it in the chat or they can
so,
take care of
so
it themselves.
whenever
I don't
whenever I
babysit my audience.
whenever I trust that somebody gets what I'm saying, that's when people later tell me I couldn't follow that, or it's just you lost
I
me
guess
at
I'm
that
more
point.
trusting of my audience.
So I've found that if I assume people know or have been following or like know why I'm saying what I'm saying, that they don't know what I'm saying and they're like, "Yo, why
To
did you
me,
go
it
off
was
track?"
very obvious how everything I just said was relevant.
Like if I
So
don't
if
headline,
people are confused or find it irrelevant, they can let me know.
yeah, if I don't headline, here's why I'm about to do this. People will not know why I'm doing this, and it's just so this is why I'm bringing it back. So when we talk about, say, like doing things to create like more systems of support for men, um, that's sort of how I look at things, right? It's the system of incentives, and if you believe in the ad, it's something like goodwill begets goodwill, right? That's essentially a statement on incentives. Um, the short-term thing is you make the support group for men. The long-term thing is the male support putting more goodwill into the air or less, right? Because long-term, especially, incentives are going to matter, especially if you're dealing with millions of people, and what types of decisions or responses they're more likely to make. The way that we go about male support or men support is going
So
to
you think
manifest.
there's like a form of negative support that you could give men that would actually make things worse? Because I just assume if it's support, it's going to be healthy
Oh,
support.
so I could see something like a an attempt at male support being made that kind of goes down more of a, let's say, an Andrew Tate kind of path, and then that's what women see when they see men support, and then it creates a backlash in them, right? Like I think if we saw the 2024 election, right, that's a backlash of young men against a system that was against them. And again, I was saying we can have this constant battle of the sexes across the generations, where it's just a bunch of negative feedback loops. And maybe that's unavoidable. Maybe nothing we do will change that. Maybe telling people, hey, the decisions you make matter insofar as they create incentives that make certain things more likely or less likely. Maybe even telling people that they will continue to do things that create negative incentives. But I'm simply pointing it out, right? Um, and so if people want to do things like that, I think what's more likely is if they're just mindful of that and they keep the focus on being beneficial for men and um, not allowing themselves to get caught up in what you might say is like their own victim narrative of here's why women are bad and here's how they've wronged me and here's how we need to stop them. In general, I have found that I myself am less productive when I am focused on like who I need to stop versus what do I intrinsically want to do. I don't think there are very many people who are intrinsically motivated by I want to stop this, I want to defeat this. Usually people say that after they have been wronged or denied something, especially something that they felt they deserved, if they worked for it and they didn't get it or it was taken from them. Um, and so, like I feel like I've ultimately managed to find some moments of happiness um, by enjoying simple pleasures simply for what they are, and not focusing on being reactive to things and letting people live rent free in my head. So I think that's essentially the approach I'm talking about there. And if people can, if men's support can engender that kind of feeling, where men are more in touch with organically what they want, and they're not caught up in a siege mentality of being against women, right? Like if you make a men's support group, but what you're doing is making essentially a tower that the women and the activists are going to besiege, that will probably not help, right? Um, so how do you make a men's support thing when it does where it does not accidentally become that? Because it can. These things can become that. Um, just as like a lot of women's support thing went from being let the women have their thing to I think a lot of them evolved over time into let's hate the men, and then look where we are.
I think it did evolve to let's hate the men. I think that strain, the seeds of that were kind of also there from the beginning in some of
Mm-hmm.
them, like the more radical ones. But I don't know that it matters if a mid support group's being besieged or not. Like just like you said, ignore the haters. Let them siege all they want. Just keep doing your group.
Well, so again, I say do it and be prepared to ignore the haters, and especially ignore them if they're going to besiege you, whatever what you do, right?
Yeah,
But
I do. But I've
you can
never
also
I like the men's groups I've been part of that had the one time we got besieged was by the Lakota Indians over some of the practices they were doing that said it was cultural appropriation and they did protests and they tried to get them to change their policies. So it was more like a racial or a cultural besiegement than any kind of gender thing. But that's the only time I've ever seen men's groups even be harassed by anybody.
mm,
So I think it's less of a danger. I mean, men can meet online privately. They can meet in each other's homes privately. They
mhm.
can meet in environments where the danger of besiegement is
True.
minimal.
They depending on how public they want to be, they can minimize the risk there, and so it just depends on what their goals are and how private or public the support group being or the support mechanism being um, fits into their goals.
We have Discord. I have a men's channel in the Discord. People are welcome to use it to meet. People that meet on here, I'm not going to let anybody come here and besiege the men. So there's spaces for all needs. They can be as public or private as they want.
Mhm. But yeah, those are my thoughts on it, and I guess we'll see if things like that ever develop. Um, one thing that's been um, really been rattling in my mind lately is um, some kind of I feel like some kind of narrative that speaks to the men's experience. Like when I say narrative, I mean like an actual like literary work would be interesting because we
They
have
have books, and Moose mentioned that was it Wild at Heart book, which I still want to read. They have a couple of really good men's books out there that offer that kind of narrative. Iron Giant by Robert Bly was one of them in the 90s.
so I'm talking about like the more recent thing. So for example, like Catcher in the Rye was it's a young adult fiction. People can still read it today, but that is also in many ways a snapshot of teenage boys in like the 50s, right? Um, and and so it was a very it was a much more resonant book then than it is now because it was capturing something that people were feeling at the time, teenage boys, but was not often publicly expressed, right? So like there's a lot of profanity in it. Um, And I
That's
feel
okay.
like even like a lot of stories with feminist messages were ones that really resonated, were ones that were saying things that a lot of women were feeling but didn't really feel like they were in a position to say. So feminine heroes like um, back when I think like that was a thing where it wasn't like this, it wouldn't have been seen like a lot of it's seen as like just being woke today, because I feel like when people talk about like pop culture being woke, it's often because they're telling a story that plenty of people are telling and nobody really feels like they can't tell, and it's like this, a script written by committee, based on focus groups and what they think is going to sell, and there's no art in it, right? Whereas, if you look at, let's say, a feminine hero by a writer in like the 1920s, rather often like that was back when writers were much more, this is what I think, this is what I feel, this is
Hmm.
what I want to write. And if it was successful, it's because were people connected with it, right? And um, there's a lot less of that now. I think a lot, because a lot of it, it's mega corporations, and they want to they want to sell stories that they think are low risk, right? They put in a certain amount of budget for publishing it or producing it for TV or movies. They want to believe that they'll get so much revenue on it to make back their investment and make some profit. And so it's a lot harder for people to put out with the kind of, if they want like this top tier budgeting, to put out something like that. I feel like, but this is also why I've often talked about why I like YouTube. I watch a lot more YouTube than I don't have the patience.
That's what I was about to say. Like, what about maybe movies or video games? Would it show up there more than maybe in a book? Since if you're looking for a modern narrative, is that a better place to look?
Um, I think one thing that's, if you write a whole book, you can tell a complete story with like a full beginning to end of like exploring themes in a way that sort of like gets people to think about them that you can't with YouTube videos and stuff, right? Like The
I haven't
Hobbit.
read The Road by Cormac McCarthy. I'm probably going to watch the movie today, but that's one that comes to mind recently that's supposed to have a lot of male themes in it, like father son
Yeah.
themes.
One thing I'll notice, like if you read like Tolkien's works, right, like The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, and I think this is part of why I've noticed Lord of the Rings memes are really popular with young men, and there are women who like Lord of the Rings. There's a certain number of them, usually like nerd girls. But Lord of the Rings, I noticed, has become a lot more popular among men in general, and I think one of the reasons is that the main characters in those are primarily men, right? It's an adventure that all male groups go on, right? In The
Oh,
Hobbit,
right.
right, Bilbo's a man. Well, he's a male hobbit. All the dwarves are men. Gandalf is male. In The Lord of the Rings, all the members of the Fellowship are male. There's a handful of female characters here and there, if only because the number of females in Tolkien's world isn't zero. Um, but most of the struggle is by men. Most of the feelings are male feelings, right? Like the feelings that men feel when they go through things. Um, and uh, and I feel like a lot of men today look to source material like that, and they thrive on it, because essentially, like these stories are like almost like uh, the fantasy isn't just the magic and the medieval aesthetic. The fantasy is like these are men experiencing things together and having camaraderie, right? And it's something that's lacking. So there's been like this new aspect of the fantasy that's been unlocked, and I think it would be interesting to see what a narrative, like if you wrote something as long as the Lord of the Rings, and you tell, essentially you use it to tell the modern young man's journey. That would be an interesting book. I suspect it'd be one that could be quite successful. Um, if somebody who's decent enough at writing committed to it and finished it.
Yeah, I wonder. It'd be interesting to know where men are getting, and if there's anybody out there in the chat or that want to comment on the video, where men are getting their modern narratives from.
Yeah. Whereas like
I,
Harry Potter is very popular too, but I noticed it's more popular with women. It's
Oh,
generally popular among millennials, but I notice Harry Potter is much more popular with women than um, the Lord of the Rings is. But Harry Potter had a female author, and there's a lot more prominent female characters in it. It's a pretty even um, collection of male and female protagonists and antagonists. So some of the most redeeming characters in the Harry Potter series are female, but also some of the worst villains in it are female. Now, ultimately, yeah, the main character is male, the main hero, Harry Potter, and the main villain is male as well. So there's some traditional elements, but there's a lot of things mixed up into it. And so there's what's interesting about Harry Potter is it's sort of like a pre-woke snapshot of like of young adults. Like young adults in a more modern, um, balanced world between the sexes, and sort of like what going through that world is like. And there's not really something that I think really captures that, right? So Lord of the Rings is a bit older. It's a it's Tolkien was a professor of Anglo-Saxon. There you can see influences of stories like Beowulf in his works and other older tales like the Ring of
the Edda.
Nibelung. Yeah, there's
Yeah.
stuff like that. So he takes a lot of it, and he sort of takes what you might say are just the best concepts. He comes up with this original composition, we'll say, right? He didn't discover any new musical notes, but he came up with his own composition, and it resonated with people. Um, and it'd be interesting to see, what could be done with a very modern, or we'll even say postmodern narrative, right? Because are we even in the modern era anymore? I know modern is often used synonymously with whatever's just happening right now, but we talk about postmodernism so much. What is the young man's story in the postmodern era? I don't know if that story's been told.
That's a good point. Yeah, I think it's a story that's always being told, but what is the modern version of it? Like
Yeah,
right
like what
now,
would I
like
point to,
post
right?
COVID.
Yeah, I can't point to like the Lord of the Rings or something or whatever. And maybe that's something it's like the Gone with the Wind was this epic, that sort of captured a certain moment in time, right? And um, what would be the modern day kind of Gone with the Wind type of story for American men? I don't know.
Um, yeah, we're trying to find the ones that don't, I guess, or
Yeah.
actually the ones that speak authentically to men's experience today. And
I
if
think I
if
think the
that
closest
experience is negative, I think that I wouldn't rule those out. I
I
just
think the
don't think it
closest
is.
example to a movie that kind of did that was Joker in 2019.
I haven't seen it.
Um,
Is it creepy?
it's I mean it's kind of a horror. It's sort of a
Yeah, I'm
horror
not gonna
esque.
watch it.
It's not like Silence of the Lambs or Nightmare on Elm Street horror, but like it's like kind of it's sort of a tragedy with certain horror elements. Right, you're just unnerved a lot. It's just things are not going well throughout the movie. Um, and Joaquin Phoenix's character as the Joker, he's this mentally unstable person who is left behind in society. And I remember a lot of liberals hated the movie when it came out. A lot of liberals complained about it, even though um, it was well reviewed. Um, it is a good movie. It's a pretty good movie.
I'm looking up now if there's a list of good movies for men recently.
Yeah. So, but I think things like that would have positive cultural examples. Um, give men something to aspire to.
Yeah, I think you're right. Um, all the lists I'm finding are like the entire history of cinema. They have The Shining at number one. Wow. Um, Godfather, The Goodfellas, Shawshank Redemption, Fight Club, Lord
Oh
of the
yeah, Fight
Rings,
Club.
Jaws. But um, yeah, I don't know if are there if you know of any, if the audience knows of any, let me know. Good modern men's movies. Like I would say at post 2020. That's what I'd be interested in. The more recent, the better. Our TV shows, movies or TV shows, because I think of shows like True Detective. I know spoke to a lot of men, but that's dated by now. It's over 10 years
Yeah,
ago.
I don't think the story, the young men who have been left behind today, that will move them has been told. So like this, their Star Wars or their version of the Matrix or whatever, like those kinds of things. I don't think that story has been told. But I think we're seeing signs of an appetite for it.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe we'll have to make it ourselves. Um, I'm interested too. I'd like to know. I don't watch a lot of modern stuff, so I can't think
Yeah,
of any.
it's hard to watch modern stuff because I mean Nathan talked about it, right? Every time something stupid happens in a TV show or a movie, he rings the
Rings the
bell,
bell.
right? And he saw a meme that basically talked about it too, and clearly he didn't know that other people were doing it, but it happens. So yeah, we might have to find it.
Well, I'm going to watch The Road today, and that was 2009, which is not recent. But
But here's what I guess, Jeff. If that book is written and it takes off, it's going to be like an independently published thing. Like you know how you can self-publish on Amazon or something. My guess is if that story is written, it's going to be that way because I don't think any of the major publishers would take it.
he's saying A Man Called Otto, but it's 2022, but it's a remake of a Swedish film from 2015. So let's see. You think it's a good? Hey Z, do you know of it? Z, do you know of any like recent men's movies that speak to the modern male experience of alienation and being left behind, et cetera, et cetera? And Mike, you think this Otto movie is a good men's movie that would be relevant? It's a bitter old man who reluctantly gets involved in the lives of his neighbors. Well, male bitterness, maybe.
And that's the thing about Joker is it's a lot of the angst and the bitterness, but it's Lord of the Rings. They save the day, right? It ends on that note, right? And so something like Joker just kind of it can remind people of how shitty the world is, but um,
So
it's not, it's not
you're
trying
looking
to
for
push.
something with ideals that like that presents some kind of ideal, whether it's going to actually be something we can hope for or not. It's aspirational,
Yeah, yeah.
something to give hope.
hmm I think that's something I feel like there aren't very many contemporary examples of that. Maybe that's a better word than modern.
I I can't think of any, but then I'm very impaired when it comes to modern media. I just don't watch enough of it
Well,
to even
I
know.
I think that's an issue. Is like there's a lot less incentive to watch contemporary media because it's so automated. It's so made on an assembly line.
What about like those TV shows like the westerns? What like eight is it 1803 or Yellowstone or those type of
Oh
shows?
yeah. I haven't really seen a lot of those, but I kind of know what you mean. Those were definitely more common, like in the 50s and 60s, like that.
Yeah,
What, like that
the
show
whole
Rawhide,
Western genre was very masculine
like
oriented.
that,
My dad grew up on those.
like that show
John
Rawhide,
Wayne.
right? And so like a show like Rawhide, I think like every week the um, you have the heroic cowboy type person fighting off the outlaw,
Yeah,
um, being tough, being confident, kind of thing, accepting responsibility of protecting his local town or something like that.
yeah, that rugged individualism and tribalism, I guess.
Whereas today, you make a show like that. Here's why Rawhide is problematic, right? You can already
Yeah, but
imagine.
ignore the haters.
But that's what deters the producers from making that kind of stuff anymore. So even though channels like ABC, NBC, CBS, rose on having programming like that in like the 50s, 60s, um, they'd be afraid to touch that stuff now.
I went back and I started watching the Andy Griffith show. It was so good. Like I think I enjoyed it more today than I even did growing up.
Here's why the Andy Griffith Show is problematic. A review.
Pony Up, is that a show?
Now he's
Oh,
telling you to pony up. He's saying that you need to
that's what
get
I
a
was
horse.
wondering. Like, y'all was need to pony up. I'm the host.
You need to get a horse and go ride, Jeff. You need
No,
to
I've been on
ride.
a horse one time in my life. I don't. They don't. Animals sense you, and they can sense that I am not. I don't have rapport with the horse.
So you need a here's what we need then, or you need. It's you need a daddy who comes up to you riding on a horse.
I don't know if I want a horse, Daddy.
He'll come to you. He's like,
Horses are
like,
like you have to raise them and keep them up and stuff. My dad is a cowboy, and I've actually had a real life horse daddy.
oh,
I don't know
okay,
if that's what I'm looking for.
interesting.
He had a ranch. He used to raise horses, and they do trail rides all the time. That's one of their hobbies. He goes to a cowboy church. So maybe
Like a
something more modern. Maybe they can ride up. They can ride up on a motorcycle. Maybe
motorcycle's like a modern day
an
horse.
iron horse, a steel
Yeah,
horse. Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
But then I'd be worried. Like a motorcycle daddy, I'd be worried about the accident rates. Every time they leave the house on the motorcycle, are they coming back?
Hmm. Maybe we need to find something else to.
They have a Hell's Angels club that opened up a block from my house. I'm not kidding. They're out there with their motorcycles all the
How many
time.
daddies are going to be in the Hell's Angels club though?
I don't know. And do I want a Hell's Angel? Again,
Yeah. Well,
problematic.
I kind of feel like they would not. I don't. For some reason, I think Hell's Angels groups are not as welcome of gay people. I
Oh, well,
think.
that wouldn't stop me.
I think.
I'm not your ordinary gay.
Think,
Right. So it's a real movie, this Pony Up thing? Because I Googled it and I got the new My Little Pony movie. That's all I could find.
oh, I remember when the My
Maybe
Little
that's
Pony
going to be
movie
the new
was
male movie. Who knows?
good. Well, in any event, Jeff, we're getting close to when this place is going to close, so I need to wrap up and hop off.
Okay, well, thanks for hanging out as usual. And
Yeah,
we'll
I
do it
thought we
again.
actually had an interesting discussion this time, for sure.
Yeah, I think it was a good one.
Yeah. All right, well, it's good talking, Jeff, and I'll see you later, chat.
Okay, take care. Have a good rest of your weekend. All right, I'm looking up this. I'm trying to find this pony movie. Mixed martial artist? I'm so confused. No, I'm not. I'm not. I hate cartoon. I'm not a cartoon person. I'm not a brony. I have no interest in it. I wasn't into the Care Bears or any of that other stuff. I don't think there's a danger. I'm going to get sucked into My Little Pony world. What I'm probably going to do is go watch The Road. That's one that's been on my list for a while, and I just remembered about it. Because supposedly it has a lot of male themes, like father-son type themes. So I think I need to see it. So if there's no panel, nobody wants to come up and chat, I think I will go ahead and wind it down. And I'm going to take the day off tomorrow. So if I show up at all, it's going to be spontaneous, but I'm not going to plan to show up at the regular time. I think I need a day off. And then I'll be back on Monday at the usual time. I think the usual time. Let me check my calendar. And I may do some evening streams, again, spontaneously, if they happen. Yep, it looks like Monday's a go. So I'll see you for sure Monday, 4 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Pacific. And if I see you before then, it will just be impromptu. Think of that, Brony. Is that a movie? They should make a movie called Brony. Hey, maybe that can be the new man movie for the modern age. Brony. The untold story. All right, take care, everybody. Do something fun the rest of your weekend, and I'll see you again at some point. Take care.